this morning. My name is Aaron Churchill, and I am the Ohio Research Director for the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, an education-focused think tank and advocacy group based right here in Columbus. Today, I'm excited to be introducing a topic that sometimes flies under the radar, but has long been of interest to us at Fordham, and it also happens to affect about thousands of Ohio families and students. The topic is interdistrict open enrollment, a longstanding state policy that allows about 85,000 students in Ohio to attend a public school in a neighboring school district. At the outset, I should emphasize that the issue we're talking about today is interdistrict open enrollment. That is when students transfer from one district to another, say Columbus to Dublin City School District, not intra-district open enrollment, which is a policy that allows students to transfer schools within a single school district. Sometimes there's some confusion over the two issues. So again, inter-district open enrollment transfers from district to district, not intra. Today we'll be hearing from Dr. Deven Carlson, a professor at the University of Oklahoma, who has done some terrific work for us that looks at whether interdistrict open enrollment has impacted the racial and socio-economic composition of Ohio school districts. As a bit of context, a few years ago, several news stories from Northeast Ohio surfaced that suggested that interdistrict open enrollment might be actually worsening segregation. And to us, that seemed a little surprising given what we thought might be going on, that interdistrict open enrollment might actually be helping to integrate schools by allowing lower income students and children of color to move to outlying school districts. To get a sense of which is closer to the truth, we asked Deven, who has done some work on open enrollment before, to dig into the data and see what answers come up. So in a minute, I'll be turning it over to Deven, who will share his findings. And after the presentation, we'll take audience questions and answers. To enter a question, you'll have two options. First of all, you can type them into the Q&A box that you see on the screen, and I'll read the question during the question and answer section. The other alternative is that you can raise your hand. There's a raise your hand icon on your screen. You'll be able to ask the question yourself during the Q&A. If you use this option, we'll be able to hear your question, but there unfortunately isn't a video component, so we won't be able to see you. And finally, as a last little bit of housekeeping, I would like to offer special thanks to the Ohio Department of Education for providing the data that made this analysis possible. And with that, I will turn the presentation over to Deven.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks for having me today. I'm happy to be here and share the results of this research. So here I'm going to share my screen and go into slideshow. So the title of this report, this research, is Open Enrollment and Student Diversity in Ohio's Schools. And just to give you a quick overview of my presentation, I'm going to talk briefly about interdistrict open enrollment in general, what the policy is, a little bit of history, just to give you some context for my research. I'll talk then about Ohio's interdistrict open enrollment program, some features of it that are worth knowing in order to interpret the findings. Third, I will detail my approach to measuring segregation in Ohio schools and districts. And in the report and in this research, I look at both racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic segregation. After that, I will talk about how open enrollment relates to segregation in Ohio school districts, both overall and in urban and non-urban contexts. And then I will zero in and look at specific districts really briefly, just to give you a sense of, even if there's, spoiler alert, no make average effects, whether there are particular districts that experience large changes. I'll take a quick look at school level segregation and then wrap up with a bit of discussion of conclusions and implications of this research. So interdistrict open enrollment started in the late 80s, and like multiple school choice policies started in the upper Midwest, in Minnesota, which implemented the first policy in 1988. And like Aaron said, interdistrict open enrollment allows students to attend school in a district other than where they live. So Minnesota implemented the first policy in 88, and Ohio and several other districts were close on its heels and implemented their policies in the early 1990s. And there are two major forms of interdistrict open enrollment, what are known as mandatory policies and voluntary policies. Mandatory policies, under that form of the policy, districts are mandated to accept students from neighboring districts. Under voluntary policies, districts are allowed to choose. They can elect whether they want to accept students from other districts or not. And even though you don't hear about open enrollment as much as, say, charters or vouchers, it's probably the most widespread school choice policy in the country. There's only 7 states that don't have some form of open enrollment. 10 states have both mandatory and voluntary programs, where they might have a voluntary program in general and a mandatory program for specific student populations, such as those attending alternative schools or in failing schools. 20 states have voluntary programs only, and then 13 states only have mandatory programs. So like I said, Ohio's program was among the first established in the country, and it's used by about 85,000, slightly more north of 85,000 students today. In the program I'm looking at today is a voluntary program where districts can refuse all interdistrict transfers, where they can opt out of the interdistrict open enrollment program completely. They can accept transfers from any district in the state, or they can elect to allow transfers only from adjacent districts. So districts in Ohio have 3 options. And about 80% of districts participate in one form or another, with the vast majority of those districts, about 70% overall, accepting students from any district in the state. Districts that choose to participate in the program have to specify their capacity levels by grade, school, and educational program. They need to come up with a plan for how transfers into the district will be assigned to their schools. And they're prohibited from selecting students on the basis of athletic, academic, or artistic ability. So no discrimination in terms of who they accept or not. And there's 4 more aspects of Ohio's policy that are worth mentioning and that are relevant to interpreting the findings today. First, their districts that participate are required to prioritize the enrollment of their in-district students. So they can only enroll students from outside the district after they have accounted for the education of all their in-district students. They are allowed to refuse enrollment on the basis of disciplinary history. So this is one exception. They're not allowed to refuse transfers on the basis of academic, athletic, or artistic talent, but they are allowed to refuse enrollment on the basis of disciplinary issues. Resident districts have no transportation responsibilities, and the receiving district, the district that's accepting the transfer, is only required to transport students from existing bus stops in the district. So in the long and short of that is that parents are responsible for getting their kids to the school where they're open enrolling. Then finally, state dollars follow the student, but the local funding is unaffected. So that's a broad overview of Ohio's program that provides important context for thinking about what we're going to do today analytically. There has been a little bit of prior work done on Ohio's open enrollment program. That work was done by myself along with Stefan Lavertu, my colleague at Ohio State. And in this 2017 report, we looked at district participation. Well, like I said, about 80% of districts participate in one form or another. And the non-participants we found are located disproportionately in the suburb of Ohio's Big 8 school districts. And this has important implications for segregation, because as these districts elect out of the program, as they opt out, this reduces the options for students in the Big 8 in terms of where they might open enroll into. We looked at student participation, and we found that across the state, white students open enroll at disproportionately high rates, and that Black students are underrepresented among open enrollers. However, and interestingly, these disproportionalities disappear when you compare the open enrollment rates of white and Black students within districts. And so this suggests that the opting out of these suburban districts surrounding the Big 8 districts is really responsible for this disproportionality that we see statewide. And we see that students transfer in general, those who participate transfer to higher achieving and more advantaged districts. So that's what we found with respect to district and student participation. And today I'm going to look at how open enrollment might affect segregation or diversity levels across Ohio districts and schools. And there are a couple different ways that the research world thinks about segregation. There's 2 main ways to conceptualize it. First, you can think about segregation in terms of exposure, in terms of the degree of contact that one group has with the second group. So how exposed are Black students to white students? How much contact do Black students have with white students, or low-income students with higher income students? So that's the first way about thinking about segregation, the exposure approach to thinking about it. Second, you can think about segregation in terms of evenness. How evenly spread are groups across given units, districts, or schools, right? So these are the two major approaches to thinking about to conceptualizing segregation, and they can lead to really different substantive conclusions. And I have a really quick little illustration here to demonstrate how that can happen. So think about a stylized world. We have two equally sized districts with two groups, Black students and white students. In District 1, we have 80% of students are being white and 20% being Black. In District 2, we have 96% of students being white and 4% being Black. If you think about this from an exposure perspective, we see low segregation levels. In both districts, Black students are quite exposed to white students. The average Black student across these districts would attend a school that's 88% white. That's a high level of exposure. But if we think about it from an evenness perspective, we think we'll see high segregation, right? Black students or white students are not evenly spread across these two districts. And so these two conceptualizations of segregation, they provide distinct information, but this information is complementary. And so because of this, it is important to use measures that align with each conceptualization. I thought, and Aaron and others think it's important to provide a measure of segregation that aligns with the conceptualization of exposure and the conceptualization as evenness. And for the exposure conceptualization, I use the exposure index, which ranges from 0, which is complete segregation, to 1, which is no segregation. And you interpret it as the level of exposure to group 1 for the average member of group 2. For evenness, I use the dissimilarity index, and this is the inverse in terms of the exposure index, where 0 is no segregation and 1 is complete segregation. I'll give you some examples of the interpretation here in a second, but it's interpreted as the proportion of a group that would need to relocate to a different unit in order to be evenly spread across all units in the state. So I apply these measures to data that the Ohio Department of Education graciously provided. And this data contains annual information on every student attending Ohio public schools between 2012-13 and 2017-18. And these data contain information on student demographics, where they were enrolled, both their school and the district they attended. And then importantly, it also contained their district of residence. So for students who open enrolled, we know the district and the school they attended, and we also know the district in which they resided. And this is important for the analyses that follow. So to provide a little context, to give you a little bit of information about the demographics of Ohio students, over the 6-year period for which I have data, here is the racial, ethnic, and the socioeconomic makeup of the Ohio student population. So we can see that the percent of white students was 75% in 2012-13 and declined to just less than 72% in 2017-18. And this decline was offset by a growth in the Hispanic student population and a growth in the population of other races, ethnicities. Black student population increased slightly, about a half percentage point. But so overall, we see a decline in the white population and a corresponding increase in the non-white population. With respect to socioeconomic makeup, we see the proportion of students classified as economically disadvantaged increased by almost 4 percentage points between 2012 and 2017. And part of this is undoubtedly attributable to the community eligibility provision, in which entire schools can become eligible to receive subsidized school lunch, and thus the classification as economically disadvantaged applies broadly. And so part of that increase is due to the growth of the CEP program. So let's move to thinking about segregation across Ohio school districts. So like I said earlier, I use the exposure index and the dissimilarity index. And the exposure index shows a black-white segregation level of 0.45. And so what does that mean? What does that substantively mean? It means that the average Black student attends a district in which about 45% of students are white. And given that 70 to 75% of students across the state are white, this implies a significant degree of Black-white segregation in Ohio schools. And this is reinforced by the Dissimilarity Index, which returns a value of 0.7, indicating that 70% of Black students would need to switch districts, would need to be relocated to a different district in order to be evenly distributed across Ohio school districts. So just as a common rule of thumb, the segregation literature says that a dissimilarity index value above 0.6 is very high segregation level. And across all US districts in 2012, some research indicated that the dissimilarity index was about 0.61. So in general, Ohio's school districts have very high levels of Black-white segregation, both relative to the rules of thumb in the literature and with respect to segregation levels across the country more broadly. With respect to socioeconomic segregation, you will see that the average economically disadvantaged student attended a school or a district that had about 33 to 40, depending on the year, percent of students who are not economically disadvantaged. So we see lower levels of socioeconomic segregation than we do with racial segregation in Ohio. So how do we think about interdistrict open enrollment segregation? Well, I do this by calculating these segregation measures, the exposure index and the dissimilarity index, under two scenarios. One, the district where they attend school, and then two, in a hypothetical world where all open enrollment students attended their district of residence. And then the difference between those two scenarios, students' district of attendance and an assumption that they attended school in their district of residence, is the impact of open enrollment on district level segregation. So that's my approach to conducting this analysis. And what does this show? Well, the important column here are these difference columns, right? This is the effect of open enrollment, and this is the exposure index. So what we see is that under open enrollment, students attend a district, the average Black student attends a district that's slightly less white, but that this effect is less than 1 percentage point. So to take the 2017-18 results, with no open enrollment, the average Black student would have attended a district that was 45.1% white. With open enrollment, that declines to 44.4. So yes, open enrollment produces a slight increase in segregation, but from a substantive standpoint, from a policy standpoint, these effects are small, less than 1 percentage point. You know, the difference between a district that's 44.4% white and 45.1% white is not that meaningful from a substantive standpoint. And when we look at socioeconomic segregation, we see effects that are very close to zero. I mean, we're talking 0.1, 0.2 percentage points. So open enrollment has no substantive effect, no effect whatsoever on socioeconomic segregation. And in effect, a positive, it slightly increases racial ethnic segregation, but the estimates are 0.5 percentage point to 0.7 percentage points. And that's the exposure index. We see a similar takeaway when we look at the dissimilarity index. With open enrollment, we would need to distribute 70% of Black students would need to change districts in order to be evenly distributed across Ohio school districts. With open enrollment, it's anywhere from 69.8 to 69.6. So substantively, no difference, right? We're still having these really high levels of segregation, regardless of whether open enrollment is in place or not. And then again, the same substantive conclusion emerges from the socioeconomic segregation analysis. So it's reasonable to think that there might be different effects by urbanicity, that open enrollment might operate differently in Ohio's urban and suburban districts than it does in the rural and small town ones. And in particular, you might think that there's a greater effect on segregation, a greater reduction perhaps in urban areas, because students of color have an opportunity to have an option to attend districts that have much more demographic diversity. But when we looked into this, the bottom line is that the effects in urban suburban areas are not meaningfully different at all from the effects statewide. a slight increase in black-white segregation like we saw statewide, less than 1 percentage point, and no effect whatsoever on economic segregation. So far, my analysis shows that open enrollment did not meaningfully affect overall diversity levels, but it could have impacted individual districts. And so for each district in Ohio, I calculated under each of the two scenarios I described earlier, students' district of attendance, and a hypothetical world where they attend school in their district of residence. I calculate the percent of white students, the percent of black students, the percent of economically disadvantaged students, and then the difference between these two scenarios for each of these three measures. And here is the resulting histogram from that. Here is how much change occurs. And so just to summarize it, we see that more than 95% of districts in Ohio had open enrollment change the percent of white students by less than 3 percentage points. So the vast majority of districts saw very little change in the demographic makeup, the racial ethnic makeup of their district. With respect to black students, we see that 95% of districts had open enrollment change the percent of black students by less than 2 percentage points. So for the vast majority of districts in Ohio, there's really very little change in the demographic composition of the district. There were 20 districts in Ohio where open enrollment decreased the percent of white students by more than 3 percentage points, and only one district where open enrollment increased the percent of white students by more than 3 percentage points. And there were 9 districts where open enrollment increased the share of black students by more than 3 percentage points. And those are the same districts where we're seeing large declines in the proportion of white, in the percentage of white students. So there are a small number of districts, 10 to 20 districts across the 600 plus in the state, where open enrollment is having a noticeable impact on the student demographics. But that as a whole, we're talking about 95% of districts where the effects just aren't very large or meaningful. We see that relative, when we look at socioeconomic composition, we see that relative to racial composition, open enrollment more frequently led to a change in socioeconomics. About 16% of districts underwent a change of at least 3 percentage points, and 6% of districts saw a change of at least 5 percentage points. And so, some of those changes were decreases, but more often than not, open enrollment increased the concentration of economically disadvantaged students than it decreased it. So ultimately, we're interested in how open enrollment affects school level segregation. At the end of the day, students attend particular schools. And unfortunately, there's no data in Ohio or elsewhere on the specific school that an open enroller would have attended in their district of residence. And so I can't use that same strategy I did in the district analysis. But I can do an analysis where I provide insight into the range of possible segregation levels, as well as the most likely level. And that analysis proceeds as follows. First, I randomly assign each open enroller to a school they could have plausibly attended in their resident district, right? The school that serves their same grade. I calculate the cross-school segregation levels under that scenario. I repeat this process many times, so 1,000 times in the analyses that follow, where each time I randomly assign that open enroller to a plausible school. And because I do this 1,000 times, the resulting calculations over those 1,000 trials will provide a sense of the minimum, the maximum, and the most likely segregation levels that could emerge across schools if students enrolled in their resident district. And there are 3 main takeaways of this analysis. One is that there is very little change in segregation levels between the minimum, the maximum, and the most likely. That all of these calculations fall in a very narrow range, less than 1 percentage point. And so this gives us quite a bit of confidence in the accuracy of the estimates that are presented in the report. Second, as with the district analysis, I find that open enrollment increases black-white segregation by a bit less than 1 percentage point. So we're talking 0.6, 0.7 percentage points. And this is true for both the exposure index and the dissimilarity index, for both conceptualizations of segregation. And again, no effect on socioeconomic segregation. So just in conclusion, this report is the first one to bring data to the debate about open enrollment and student diversity in Ohio. And there's several important takeaways. There's a slight increase in black-white segregation as a result of open enrollment, but the effects are less than 1 percentage point. From a policy standpoint, we're not talking about anything that should drive the debate on this policy. Second, there is no effect on socioeconomic segregation. Third, there are a handful of districts where open enrollment meaningfully changed the composition of the student body. But again, 95% of districts, there's no meaningful change in the socioeconomic composition. And then the fourth, I find that the school level results, the results for school level segregation are very similar to the district level results. So the implications of these empirical findings are, one, that the effect of open enrollment on diversity should not be driving the debate over this policy. Fewer than 10% of Ohio students participate, and so we're only going to affect diversity on the margins. Residential decisions are going to be far more consequential in determining segregation levels across Ohio schools and districts than anything open enrollment is ever going to contribute. So this means that other dimensions of open enrollment, the achievement dimensions, the opportunity dimensions, should really be at the forefront of policy debates, in my view. Second, I think it highlights the importance of district participation decisions. The non-participating districts located in the Big 8 suburbs undoubtedly influence the findings of this analysis to some degree, right? These are not options. These overwhelmingly white and affluent districts are simply not options for students to transfer into. And so by limiting the transfer options, you're also thereby limiting, affecting the effect that open enrollment can have on diversity. And so the bottom line, what I came away from after conducting this analysis is that as it's presently practiced, open enrollment is affecting diversity in a way that's not consistent with either the wildest dreams of its proponents or the worst fears of its skeptics. And with that, I will close and look forward to questions.
Okay. Well, thank you, Deven, for the great presentation and the great research as well, which can be found on, the whole report can be found on the Fordham Institute website, www.fordhaminstitute.org. And you can take a look at the report and read the whole thing for yourself. At this time, we will start transitioning over to a Q&A session. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there are two options by which you can ask a question. The first is to type your question into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And if you choose that option, I will read the question and one of us will answer. And then the other option is to raise your hand. And in that case, I will we'll basically call on you and you'll have an opportunity to ask the question yourself. So I guess to sort of kick off the Q&A, and feel free if you're in the audience to just start pouring the questions into the Q&A. But I wanted to kick off the question with one myself that I had. So Deven, you've talked a lot this morning about open enrollment's effects on school integration, which is a really important dimension of thinking about the program and whether it's leading to more diverse schools or less diverse schools. But one thing you haven't really talked about at all is whether open enrollment actually affects students and their achievement. Another important aspect of evaluating the program. And you mentioned this earlier in your slides, you did some research on this topic a few years ago, where you did look at some of the effects on the academic outcomes of kids who use this. And I just wanted to ask, for those who haven't read that report, what did you find about academic effects of open enrollment?
Yeah, so we look closely at the academic effects of open enrollment, and what we found there was that the effects differed by whether students were consistent open enrollers or transitory open enrollers. And for consistent open enrollers, we saw modest achievement gains, right? We saw, that if you consistently open enrolled, you exhibited achievement growth that was meaningfully higher than the achievement growth of students who did not open enroll. And for students who were from high poverty urban districts, consistent open enrollment was associated with substantial achievement gains. I mean, we're talking relatively large gains in terms of educational interventions. So consistent open enrollment, particularly out of high poverty districts, was associated with significantly higher achievement gains than for students who didn't open enroll. For students who transition in and out of the program, who might open enroll 1 year but not the next, with that lacked that consistency, we didn't find much in the way of achievement effects. But for those students who are consistent open enrollers, we saw significant positive gains in academic achievement.
That's great. And that report was actually also a Fordham report, co-authored with Stefan Laverty, as you mentioned. But I think you make a really important point about who benefits the most from open enrollment, and that is the students from the high poverty, from the Big Eight, who actually have opportunities to transfer. But the sort of the ironic thing about how Ohio's open enrollment program works is that those are the students who have the least amount of open enrollment options. And there's a map in the report, in both reports actually, that shows the geographic sort of pattern of which districts participate and which don't. And you sort of see a lot of suburban districts around the big cities not participating, thus limiting some of the options for the kids in the city.
Yeah, I think that's a big conundrum, that the students who benefit most have the least opportunity. And other states get around that by operating mandatory policies. And I think that's one thing that Ohio might do well to consider.
Right. So go back to the mandatory policies. Do you know which states have a sense of which states do actually require their districts to open enroll? Or
yeah, places like Colorado, places like Wisconsin. There are a few, there are other districts in the upper Midwest. Minnesota's policy, the first one, is a mandatory policy. There are still exceptions. If these districts are at capacity, they are allowed to not accept transfers. But in general, I think that the policies in place in states like those kind of get around the limiting opportunities that you see in the Ohio context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's an important policy issue. We raised it a little bit in the forward with my colleague Chad Aldis. We wrote a forward to the report, and everyone should obviously read it because it's great. But we recommend actually that Ohio does move to a mandatory policy, of course, subject to whether there's actually building capacity. And in a lot of districts, I would presume that there's actually capacity for some of the school districts to take more students from outside their district. I would suspect so. But obviously, if you're a district that is full, you shouldn't. We're not recommending that a new school building be built. But if you do have capacity, certainly I think that option should be on the table. And there's actually somewhat of a financial benefit too, in the sense that your fixed costs, if you're a school district and you have capacity, you've already covered your fixed costs. And the state money follows the student into your district. So there should be an economic gain if you accept students from outside your district. Okay. Let's see, is there something in the chat or any others? Oh, okay. So we have a question here from an audience member about, has there ever been research done from other states on diversity and school segregation, perhaps in the context of open enrollment?
So there has been a little bit done. I did some of that research in the context of Colorado's program. And what I found in Colorado is actually very similar to what I found in Ohio, where there is a slight increase in racial ethnic segregation. Again, we're talking, half a percentage point. So nothing that will even approach the segregation that's driven by residential decisions. But in Ohio or in Colorado, there's a significant decline in socioeconomic segregation. Again, significant is we're talking a percentage point. So nothing, again, substantial from a policy or societal standpoint, but from a programmatic standpoint, Colorado's program reduces socioeconomic segregation slightly. There's been a little bit of work in specific metro areas in Phoenix, in the Twin Cities, in Minnesota, that reaches, varying conclusions. The Twin Cities analysis found it to increase segregation in that metro area. And so what's really apparent across the literature is that the effects are context specific, right? How open enrollment operates is really dependent upon the nature of the policy that's in place, the nature of residential decisions that families and households make in the different metro areas, how school districts are drawn up, right? And so it's hard to make any sort of blanket statement on the effect of any choice policy, or in particularly open enrollment on segregation, because all of the results are so context specific.
That's great. We have a question in the Q&A box that says, is there any hypocrisy when school districts argue that they are open to all, but many have chosen to prohibit non-resident students from attending? Many of these same districts often argue against charter schools and vouchers, other forms of school choice. So what do you think about that question, Deven?
So I think that, I'll leave it to others to decide the degree of hypocrisy, but I think it's undeniable that that housing affordability, that district lines determines where students can attend school, right? I mean, that's the one thing that I think becomes very clear, is that if you can afford a house in a specific area, you can attend the public schools in that district. And so that is, there is a degree of, the association between wealth and perceived school district quality is one, I think is a major problem, and that there are a lot of different ways and different folks have different ideas for trying to address it. But it's undeniable that wealth, and particularly the ability to purchase a house or live in a specific district, is a hugely limiting factor in the schools that you can ultimately enroll your child in.
Definitely. You talked a little bit more about the effects of residential patterns and the housing patterns that we have in America in determining which school a child attends. I think issues of school segregation and integration are going to become more, maybe possibly more, on top of people's minds as we start thinking about, as a nation, what about some issues in systemic injustice. And just wondering, I mean, school integration is certainly something that education reformers have tried to work on for many decades, yet we still see results like we saw today from Ohio, where schools are highly segregated. What are some of the challenges that you see, Deven, around trying to integrate schools? You mentioned housing as being one, probably maybe the driving factor. But can you think of other issues and barriers that are preventing integrated schools? And do you see any other avenues of trying to improve school integration?
I mean, I think a hugely limiting factor is it's politically unpopular. Right. So it's not that there haven't been efforts to integrate schools over the years. It's that these efforts require a large political lift that over time typically prove to be unsustainable. And I think one of the best examples of that is Wake County in Raleigh-Durham area of North Carolina, where, throughout much of the 2000s, they had an integration effort where they would reassign students. They used magnet programs to try to ensure that no more than 45% of students at any school in the district were eligible for free or reduced price lunch, and that no more than 25% of students were achieving below grade level. So they had these targets to achieve relative balance in economic makeup and in achievement outcomes across schools in the district. And that was in place for 10 years, but it ultimately proved politically unpopular. And in 2009, 2010, the school board elections came out such that a slate of board members were elected who ran on the platform of returning to neighborhood schools. And so, you know, there have been efforts, there are efforts, and there are districts that do better and worse at achieving these sorts of integration. But, you know, there are so many inputs into the problem, residential decisions, political difficulties, that it's been proven over time to be really difficult to sustain any sort of integration initiative.
Yeah, I wonder if the politics might be changing too. I mean, especially over what we're, you know, sort of what we've been talking about as a nation and in the media and that, and hopefully within school leaders as well, about trying to, you know, create a more equitable society, more equitable schools, and give every child opportunities that they deserve. And hopefully some of those political issues might become less of a barrier moving forward.
Yeah, I think that, you know, that's that'd be an ideal outcome. Although we just saw, you know, the difficulties that Montgomery County, Maryland went through when they proposed redrawing some of their school attendance boundaries. And so, you know, I think it will take a significant degree of political will to make improvements on this effort. So whether it's encouraging district you know, boards of education to participate in, to accept open enrolling students, whether it's to draw school attendance boundaries in a manner that promote rather than decrease levels of school integration. These are all decisions that operate politically and that are politically really difficult, but I think would ultimately be net quite beneficial for all students if we're able to move in that direction.
Yeah, definitely. We have a question. We have a few more minutes. And again, if you're in the audience and you want to ask a question, is there still time to do that? Is there a way to possibly model out what might happen to segregation levels if the wealthier school districts in Ohio did decide to accept non-resident students?
Absolutely. I mean, you could make some assumptions, you know, you could do an analysis where you make some assumptions about, you know, how many students and what their student characteristics are of students who transfer into these other districts, what that might look like. And you could absolutely come up with some sort of simulation, some sort of model about how that might affect, you know, top line segregation levels across districts. You know, it's a little bit difficult because the lack of participation of these districts for so long makes it difficult to know, you know, what the transfer patterns would look like if those districts ultimately elected to participate. But you could make some reasonable assumptions based on other states, based on, you know, the smaller set of affluent, wealthy, and affluent districts that do participate, and that could inform, I think, a really interesting analysis about how segregation levels might change if that participation were to occur.
Yeah. We have a hand raised in the audience. So I think, Jeff, do you want to open that up?
Yeah. Has anybody done any research, either from Fordham or you, Dr. Carlson, on thematic schools and their effects on segregation?
So I personally have not, and I'm honestly not aware overall of research in that realm. I do know that there are a number of districts across the country that use magnet programs that use you know, those sorts of thematic approaches to try to integrate schools in the district, where, say, like, for example, schools in Wake County for a long time would put desirable magnet programs. It would locate them in schools that would otherwise have been residentially zoned to student populations that were overwhelmingly Black and economically disadvantaged. And they put those magnet programs there in an effort to draw a more diverse student population to those schools. But those are more anecdotal than systematically examined.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Dave. We have a question in the chat box that says, as far as politics, has anyone tried to engage teachers in suburban districts on the equity issues of opening up enrollment? So there you go. There's the question.
You know, I'm not. The short answer is I don't know. I'm not aware of any. And Aaron, you might be better situated to speak to that political issue.
Yeah, I'm not aware. I mean, I think as far as how open enrollment decisions happen at a district level, it would be, I'm sure, the decision of the school board and the local superintendent. Certainly, I think if teachers and parents as well got engaged in this and said, hey, you know, this is an important issue from an equity and inclusion standpoint, the channel would probably be to contact your local school board member or your local superintendent and say, hey, this is an important issue to allow, you know, all kids to attend their schools. And that I think would be a tremendous way of working politically to possibly break down the barriers in some of these districts. All right. Well, we are a little past time, but I wanted to maybe take 1 or 2 minutes to see if there were any other questions from the audience. And if not, we'll wrap up. All right. So hearing none, thank you, Deven, for your great presentation today. Again, the report is available online at the Fordham Institute's website. You can read this report, which Deven did on the impacts of segregation. You can also find his previous report that looked at the academic effects of open enrollment on our website. That report is from 2017. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning. We should be having some future webinars, hosting future webinars this spring, so be on the lookout for those as well. So Deven, thanks again for your time, and thanks everybody for joining us this morning.
Thank you.